Excellent. Do you all see my screen? I think, yeah, fantastic. Thanks a lot. Great. So I'm just going to move this here so that I can also see you in parallel. Okay, here we are. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today here for the launch of our Housing for a Post-Growth World and this manifesto. Some small, quick housekeeping rules. You all know how challenging it can be to be on Teams, so to remember to mute your microphone. The event is recorded. This is because we would like many more people to have access to the manifesto beyond the written form, and so that they will be able to listen to that at their own pace. And there's going to be time for questions. Feel free to write them in the chat, comments, ideas, thoughts. But at the same time, the presentation is going to be rather short, about 25 minutes. So we will have quite some time to discuss all together at the end, to unmute yourself, to share your thoughts. So my name is Anna Pagani. I'm a senior lecturer at King's College London, and I'm here with Hans and Daniel. So Hans, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, hi, I'm Hans. I'm based at the TU Dresden, and I'm a postdoc research assistant here at the Institute of Geography.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm based at the Bartlett School of Planning in London, and I'm a lecturer in planning and studies. Yeah.
Thanks. So you'll hear from all of us today. So I just want to start by explaining how it came about. I mean, how this manifesto was designed. We all agree, and if you're here today, it's most likely because you do too, on the fact that providing housing for all is central to building any kind of future. But what we have today is a system that is not designed in such a way. But what does it mean to think in terms of a post-growth future for providing such kind of housing? So the best way for those who are new to the idea of post-growth and degrowth to understand what this means is to use a metaphor that I really like actually to use with my students, which is that of a football game. So if you think of a football game, and if we were to change a player, well, we might have a bit of a stronger team, but fundamentally the game will not change. We will still have a football game. If we change the rules of the game, let's see, from football to basketball, we will have a pretty different game. But the strategies and the goal, the ultimate goal, won't really be affected. We will still seek success at all costs. And all the strategies will be designed in such a way. But if we change the goal of the football team, for instance, from winning to cooperating or even losing, well, we'll have very different players, maybe slowly crossing the field, trying to make sure not to score, have a very, very different system. So we can imagine a post-growth world as a world that has successfully changed that goal of the system from growth for the sake of growth to conviviality, ecological sustainability, global and social and local justice, and participation. And this goal shift is critical in a world where our planetary boundaries are being crossed and where social injustice is skyrocketing. So we are a group of practitioners, of activists, of researchers who came together this summer in Oslo at the International Degrowth Conference to share and discuss different efforts that each of us in our day-to-day life we're doing towards this idea of housing for a post-growth world. And at the end of the conference, we've put together the ideas that we had and the different propositions that we had in the manifesto that you hopefully had the chance to read. The manifesto does not stop at a critique of the current system. There is plenty of such critiques, and most likely if you're in the call, you also share many of those. But we also wanted to show initiatives from across the globe, without being exhaustive, of course, but we did our best, that try to reveal how people are already building homes that are rooted in care, equity, and ecological responsibility. So what we want to do today is to really try to create a shared language. And to do that, I will let now Daniel go to the first step of the manifesto.
Thank you. So coming out of the workshop, we had a whole series of presentations right across the world. And there was a generous sharing of these ideas. And the first sort of underpinning thread that we thought and came together as a sort of first point was the need for essentially an ideological shift in our understanding of the home. Increasingly, homes and houses are treated as assets and as commodities to be traded. And the common thread really throughout is trying to shift the idea of the underpinning status quo, ideological status quo of having a property owning democracy and promoting that, entrenching ideas around security, autonomy, and belonging coming only through some form of individualized property ownership. And that becoming the foundational right that underpins our society, leading to commodification, financialization, a whole series of mechanisms where credit markets and speculative mechanisms have set in and been very much encouraged. And rather, we would like to sort of replace that, or shift that towards an idea where solutions are created to create a shared foundation of health and community, and removing the sort of the effects of inequity, displacement, homelessness, and essentially moving towards a housing system that really is central to this first point that we're trying to make around alternative housing narratives needing to be reaffirmed around collective well-being, shared resources that are grounded in care, affordability, and connection to place. So this is our sort of first point in the manifesto. And what we were seeing was very much the effects of financialization, of speculation, of housing crises being repeated across the world, and people taking to the streets, people creating movements, oppositional movements as well as propositional. The first photo is from recent marches in Spain, in Catalonia, where the sort of slogan is El techo es un derecho, so housing rights as a slogan, but very much as a collective enterprise of trying to come up with alternative. And the example from Catalonia is very important in the sense that they, through the social movement, gaining power, have been able to promote new policies at the sort of municipal level around decommodifying housing. The other aspect that we wanted to touch on was not just about housing quality, but about the range of housing that is empty, essentially, and the inequity of distribution of housing. And one phrase that really resonated was around an account of squatting and the shift in language around squatting. Instead of calling it squatting, calling it liberating. So this idea of there being a shift both in ideology, but in the sort of language that we're able to use to articulate new policies, new ideas of redistribution as well. And coming to the bottom as some examples, this is from Uruguay, housing cooperative in Montevideo, mutual aid housing cooperative, producing through its networks a real different form of housing provision, rooted in mutual aid, rooted in the sort of cooperative ideas, but at quite a large scale. This is through the FUCVAM network. And finally, this is an example from closer to home in the UK of this idea of the co-housing. So we have emergence of these different forms of decommodified in different ways and to different extent, models like the community land trust, cooperatives, co-housing, essentially finding new forms of shared, collective, and convivial quality homes for all through these different models. Underpinning this need to really change our ideology of what it is to produce housing.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Daniel. So this was sort of the first nexus that we had identified in Oslo and also in our collective work on these issues. And we're now moving on to the second, which is really about the commodification of housing. And the issue here is that commodified housing distorts the true purpose of a building, which would be to provide a home. So homes, commodified homes, are treated as investments or assets rather than a place to live and to care for each other. And this dynamic is fueling speculation, it is driving up prices, and it is ultimately displacing or even squeezing out people of their homes. And what we see is that this process is unfolding at a terrifying pace globally. Housing affordability as well as access is undermined, social inequalities are exacerbated, and within this dynamic, we see the continuous prioritization of profit over the needs of communities. So what commodified housing does is it incentivizes demolition, continuous development and redevelopment for profit reasons, resource-intensive construction, and all of this results in excessive amounts of material use and waste, for example, cement, which significantly impacts nature and negatively affects biodiversity. So the core of this problem is that commodified housing is catered towards investment rather than people and disconnects it from principles of collective well-being. So we have a central claim, and that is that housing needs to be liberated from market pressures and reclaimed as a collective right and ecological responsibility, ensuring homes that nurture communities and care and enable sustainable human-nature relations. And globally, we already see a multitude of initiatives trying to challenge the dominant form of commodified housing and addressing wider social, ecological, and economic concerns. And there are different strategies in place. They often focus on providing community-oriented and commons-based forms of housing, and there are some successful examples for this. For example, La Borda in Barcelona or Kalkbreite in Zurich. You see a picture from Zurich of Kalkbreite in the top left of the screen. There are also umbrella organizations, so organizations that don't only focus on individual projects, but on organizing collectively. For example, the German Mietshäuser Syndikat, the National Cooperative Housing Federation in India, or the South African shack dwellers movement. And you see a photo of a protest organized by the shack dwellers movement in South Africa in the top right of this picture, of the screen. What is also central to these sort of initiatives are forms of collective land ownership, for example, in community land trusts, in order to limit speculation on rising land prices, but also crucially to involve communities and neighborhoods in decision makings. And there are examples around the world. And in our manifesto, we list the London Community Land Trust in the UK, the Voi Community Land Trust in Kenya, and also the Favela Community Land Trust in Brazil. And on the bottom left of the screen, you see a picture of the 50th anniversary of the Favela Community Land Trust. There are also policy frameworks and programs in place that support these initiatives in scaling out by limiting possibilities for profit-oriented investment, but also by providing decommodified housing, as well as by strengthening collective and mutual financing programs, and also by assisting in balancing out ecological trade-offs of new development. And there are a few examples in place as well. The Housing and Development Board in Singapore would be one the limited profit housing system in Austria is one, as well as the community mortgage program in the Philippines. So what we see is that both self-organization and active regulation have been and continue to transform contemporary housing systems, reorganizing them around care and sustainable human-nature relations. And in the bottom right, you see another example of a co-housing program from Australia that is focused on self-organization.
So continuing from these 2 points to the third key issue that we identified is that housing is very strongly unequally distributed. And here we have on the one hand homelessness and temporary accommodation that are nearly just the tip of an iceberg that creates incredibly high economic and social cost. We have, especially in high and upper middle income countries, underoccupied, vacant and second homes. And these fuel what we could call an artificial tension between on the one hand, the housing demand for homes, and on the other hand, ecological sustainability. So this, let's say, separation or this incompatibility between social and environmental goal is the result of this artificial scarcity of housing. So as a result, what happens is that there is a narrative of an absolute lack of housing units, which eventually support a green growth, and all arguments of having to build ever more that we see quite strongly across countries, but in an environmentally efficient way. So we have the demolition of existing homes and the introduction of denser, often net zero buildings as the kind of silver bullet solution to our current crisis. So, and this, of course, doesn't take into account not only the displacement of people, so the social impact that this has, but also the grey energy that is encapsulated in the existing stock. So here we define this in such a way for which the environment keeps paying the burden of social inequalities. So we formulated the point of the manifesto that house building targets need to be based on a just, sufficient, and collectively agreed distribution of the housing stock, which is focused on enhancing the quality, accessibility, and environmental performance of existing homes. Luckily, there is already quite many initiatives that are also looking into that, and we hear more and more the stronger and stronger focus on the existing housing stock. Across the world, we have initiatives that are supporting construction halts or moratoriums, so pauses in the construction of new buildings. Moratorium on new construction has been called in countries like Switzerland, where actually a book was produced by Charlotte Malterbart. In the UK, we've been working on that, what it would mean to stop building in places like Denmark as well. And these may sound counterintuitive at first, because we have a housing crisis, so how could we stop building? But actually they resonate with the experience of many communities that indeed have faced all broken promises, displacement, and all the issues linked to redevelopment, while in parallel, it also resonates with what we see as the deterioration of a natural landscape in favor of construction process that eventually only has very, very limited impact on affordability and access to housing. So, and in parallel to these initiatives of stopping construction, which we see on the left-hand side of the slides, on the right-hand side, we see other initiatives that are gaining quite some momentum across the world. We have innovative experiments, again, for instance, in Switzerland, such as Mehr als Wohnen. This is a very large housing cooperative where you've got smaller private spaces that are integrated with collective rooms and a number of shared amenities, which also creates a form of flexibility for for the household during their life cycle. That's one of the beautiful things also of housing cooperatives in Switzerland, is that they also give you the possibility to downsize when, for instance, your household decreases and within the same cooperative. But also another beautiful example is that some housing cooperatives put the washing machine in the best floor, actually on the top floor of their building, so that people can drink coffee while they while they wait for their laundry to be ready. So creating really places of conviviality within buildings while reducing the space that we are consuming, which raises the question of what is the extent to which a very small apartment in front of a busy road is the same amount of square meters, but that have a very accessible street in the front and a lot of shared spaces. So that's also one of the limitations of talking in terms of square meters only, without thinking about the fact that the boundaries of homes are broader. And perhaps another and last example is also Generationen WG in Berlin, that actually offers the opportunity for empty nesters to activate those empty nesters, or those households whose, for instance, children have left, and to create opportunities actually for younger generations to live together in intergenerational housing. So these are very important. Again, these initiatives are not only a matter of reducing the amount of housing that we consume, so the square meters that we consume, but also to break the ideologies that Daniel was talking about, and linking to the next point that Hans will now make on expanding boundaries of care.
Yeah, so Anna, you talked about the artificial scarcity that is constructed. We identified an artificial boundary that is also inhibiting the provision of social ecological housing, and that the focus needs to be broadened in terms of what housing provision actually constitutes. Because what we observe is that housing issues continue to be addressed in silos, but the real causes span far beyond just the housing realm. It is impacted by the health systems, the labor markets, the education systems, and certainly community life. So what we have is a political focus on individual units and their numbers, which discredits the complex nature of housing provision that is geographical, social, and certainly also multi-scalar. What is also ignored are the larger physical as well as social networks that housing would be embedded in. And then certainly also the struggles that form around this multi-scalar interplay. So there's a fake conceptual boundary, and this fake conceptual boundary weakens the function of housing as an infrastructure, because when housing provision is addressed in these silos, then it is very easy to overlook the importance of the broader system and to create alliances between stakeholders within these broader systems. So therefore, our fourth and last claim of the manifesto is that housing needs to be reconceptualized as a decentralized infrastructure that extends beyond the individual unit and households, supporting multi-scalar amenities and alliances. And there is a growing number of initiatives that are addressing this need to broaden the focus, that are rescaling, if you wish, the housing debate by decentralizing housing provision on the one hand, but also by working in symbiosis with broader systems and mobilizing alliances beyond housing on the other hand. One example for this would be the cooperative, which you can see a picture of on the top left here. Lilac is a community of 20 eco-built households in West Leeds that is exemplifying a sort of decentralized care-based living, but is also highlighting the wider system transformations needed pertaining to, for example, food systems and also community living. It is also valuing time spent in care and mutual support organized around the home, which are often excluded from dominant economic frameworks. Another example that we discussed also in our workshop is the Kau Leuven Living Lab, which is a material bank, but also which are also self-built homes and collective housing projects that demonstrate ways to work in symbiosis with the social economy and the broader urban system, moving beyond isolated experiments. You see an example of this on the bottom left of the screen, where what they do is they try to also enable the participation of economic actors in the social economy by supplying these self-built homes, for example. These processes can be referred to as sort of infrastructuring. So what they do is they link housing struggles with wider agendas, such as labor, gender, energy, and food justice, and thereby build collective momentum for systemic change. There are concrete projects that are doing this, and here's an example of the reaffirm, which is a cooperative in Amsterdam that is trying to incorporate these efforts of infrastructuring on the basis of an individual project. But then there's also organizations such as Amixtel Moviment Quart Mon, which you see on the bottom right of this screen. There you see a photo taken at a workshop that was organized with families who are being squeezed out of their homes, evicted. And this is embedded in broader movements of Right to the City initiatives around the world. So you see a multitude of different scales here at play, from the individual project to struggles for systemic change. And what they all have underlying is the need to not address issues such as housing or care or food in silos, but to see them as possibilities for systemic transformation.
Thank you, Hans, and thank you, Daniel. So we now have launched this Housing for a Post-Growth World Manifesto. So what are a little bit our next steps? So on the one hand, we're encouraging everyone to add the signature to the manifesto. We collected many. We're very happy. We want to be able to share it as broadly as possible. This will actually support and then bring legitimacy to the manifesto. So we can see then how we can have discussions on how it can be leveraged in different ways. Feel free to sign in terms of an individual or organizational or as a resident. There is no rule about this. Feel free to reach out to propose initiatives or new projects or articles that you want to write on our Substack channel. We are all working in different ways. When I mean working, it's activism, it's being a resident, it's being a tenant in the housing realm. And we're happy to use the Substack channel that we have created, where we launched the manifesto, to promote a number of initiatives that can fit within the umbrella of housing for a post-growth world. So we would really like to use this platform to amplify different voices. So feel free to write to us if there is an initiative, a video, an interview, anything that you would like to share, or an article that you would like to write. We have the manifesto is being translated into different languages. We know that in the degrowth realm, there is a lot of discussion on trying to disrupt the hegemony of the English language. And we would really like to make this manifesto as accessible as possible across the world in ways for which local communities can use it within their own language. So if you know any language and you would like to translate the manifesto, please reach out to us. It would be absolutely great. And if you also have a website or a group or anything where you'd like to publish the manifesto, please let us know, and we're very happy to promote it also on the Substack. And yeah, so the other next step it is a discussion that we can also have today, is to basically move from this channel that we have in this post-growth kind of platform that we've created towards something that looks more like a coalition, potentially, or a collective, as we write it here, and what form this collective would take place and what would be its objective is something that we would like to discuss with a much bigger group. So we're open to discussions on what the next steps in terms of the form of this organization could look like. Just a quick add, the Spanish and Catalan manifestos have been published. This was the great work from our colleague Jess from the association that before Hans named, and showed the example indeed of the great work that they're doing in order to support different communities who've been evicted, displaced, and so on and so forth in Catalonia and in Barcelona in particular. So you can have access to that either on our Substack or on the shared folder at this link that we're happy to share. And we also wanted to bring down here the list of all the special session contributors who've contributed with their knowledge. So we really want to make clear the fact that this manifesto is really been put together through the knowledge of all of these people who've taken part in the conference and through also the kind contribution of our external experts, Paul and Anitra. So now we have time for sharing. We actually have 25 minutes, which is great. And this sharing time, we would like to open it to, it can be reflections, it can be questions, but also it can be initiatives that you think would forge alliances with housing degrowth, maybe some things that you think that would fall within this umbrella, or that could be amplified by our platform. So it will be a rather open discussion. We have time for this, luckily, and it's just the first of others coming into the future. So I will stop sharing my screen, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, Anna. There's already a couple of questions Sue James has, and one from Michael Edwards. I don't know if Sue James want to. We can open that up, or I can read out your question.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. So I had two questions, but one of them is that it seems to me our economy depends on this crazy asset value, embedded in these ridiculous house prices. How are we going to kind of move this entrenched approach to take a non-commodified view of housing? Because when the government ever talks to anybody about any of these things, they immediately talk to the house builders. Who the hell are the house builders? But they talk to them and they have a very strong view. And because the government's tied itself to this 1.5 million, it's listening to the house builders. And so we go on in a sort of circle. How are we going to answer the questions that will be pushed back to us when we say housing should not be commodified? And how do you make that shift from this very entrenched view to a different way of doing things, which would actually then answer all sorts of other social and environmental problems that the present system's giving us? I think that's my question, sort of, or comment, whichever you might take it as.
Thank you, Sue. Hans, you might want to start taking this up.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, thank you for that prompt. And it's a huge challenge for sure, because there are past dependencies that we can't take back, and there's a structural dependence on inflated house values as long as the economy is organized around these things. So I think this is where we would have to argue against that. There needs to be a continuation of a system that is continuously dependent on the inflation of house price values, and we don't have to go back very far in the past to point to the extreme unsustainability in economic terms of the system. I mean, only in 2008 it already imploded, and actually it was caused by the inflation of fictitious values of houses. And once the material base, i.e. the house builders, who couldn't pay their credits anymore, caught up with this, then the whole system broke. And for some reason, the reaction to this seems to have a almost more financialized housing system, but that is more dependent on corporations. And I think this is another challenge, that within this financialized ecosystem, now the really powerful actors and the ones who structurally also depend on the continuous house price inflation are not necessarily private households anymore, but big corporations who are even public corporations. And there, I think it is actually quite easy, not just on moral grounds, but actually on regulatory grounds, to intervene as a state if the political will would be there, because this process can be reversed by state regulation, I would argue. And I think this is where the bottom-up initiatives that we have mostly presented now contribute maybe to a view to broaden the focus, as we have called it, but then there also needs to be regulation in place that is acting towards a housing system where the people have the power over their homes and not financialized corporations. That would be my answer to that.
Great. Thank you, Hans. Daniel, did you want to add something, or we move to the next question?
No, I think it's a really important question to ask, and I don't think there is one answer. I think what we try to highlight in this manifesto is there obviously needs to be an ideological shift. How does that happen? That happens through a combination of these different social movements, ranging from rent movements and tenant movements, but also examples of people organizing and supporting community-led housing, for example. But that's on a very small scale, obviously. But I suppose it's that move from seeing these as examples and using those as ways of shifting policy at very local levels, and then seeing that being emulated at municipal levels, eventually filtering from the bottom up to the government level. I imagine that will take a lot of time, but maybe part of these cycles, economic cycles, which we're trapped within, will be part of the imperative to take up these sort of more prefigurative examples and make them more widespread. So I don't think it's simple, but it's part of this kind of movement at many different scales, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think it aligns very well with what actually Billboard just wrote in the chat, which is indeed to start local and then show these virtuous examples. And we see it also very much with the spreading of community and trust. I know that in the call right now we also have Julia, who shared their latest report. So we see that these are really showing some good examples that then are attracting attentions at all levels of decision making, showing how communities can be empowered to change the housing system from the bottom up. So I agree. I saw a few questions that a little bit intersect in terms of the perhaps the stopping construction and where employment is and what will happen. So I can pick that one quickly. It was a question a bit between Sue and Michael. So for what concerns I think it's a very good point, and it links to what Hans was saying in the expanding the boundaries also of housing, the link between employment and where housing is, because we could see, for instance, from the UK case that we do have 1.5 million empty homes, and there is often the argument that these are located in the wrong places, but it's not necessarily true, because in the city of London, in the borough, in the main centre, we've got more than 20% of empty homes. So they're actually located, or also Cambridge is one of the ghost towns, and there is a lot of demand in Cambridge too. So, and then of course, at the same time, in other locations in coastal areas in the UK, then we do have the market of second homes that eventually has displaced local communities and make it very difficult to find a job and to find a community to live in. So these issues are interconnected eventually, because you can't find housing, you can't start your small business, and there is only a tourism that comes in specific season, so it has a systemic impact. But whether the whole construction industry would, let's say, collapse, I would say absolutely not, because we do have an immense work of retrofit and of using the vacant housing stock that we have and bringing up to standards, for which I think in the paper that at the time we wrote, we showed that actually from the perspective of how much work needs to be done is quite ambitious. And a colleague of mine has done a calculation for Switzerland and for the UK, for which to provide housing with the maximum projections of population growth, but by using only the space that we need, we will need something about 14 years using the workforce, the existing workforce, and by counting also the time of retraining them, and we would actually disassemble a lot of the housing stock that we have. So it was another interesting study. I don't know whether, Daniel, you saw other comments or questions in the chat, but if you have any comment or anything, please raise your hand, jump in, or even ideas of, feel free. Thank you, Michael. Any comments or reflection? Yeah, please, Michael, go ahead.
Thank you. This is really going very well. It's really interesting. On this issue of how we somehow take housing out of this asset value inflation chase, seems to me to include 2 or 3 specific things that have to change. One is there has to be other places for households to put their savings. I mean, in the last 30 or 40 years in Britain, and clearly in lots of other countries, when people have surplus money, they these days tend to buy bigger houses or move to or have a second house or a third one, or one way or another pour it into housing, which is part of the problem. There need to be other avenues into which people can put this surplus cash. I get the impression that in some countries there are other things people do, like in Germany, there's a tradition of putting your savings into business growth and stuff. So that's one point. The other comment is that at the moment, in England anyway, there's a bit of a crisis in the house building industry, the commercial house building industry. They can't sell anything at the moment, so it's kind of stalled. But this, of course, is a wonderful thing, because it will lead to price crashes. And this may be the only way really to undermine people's confidence in the endless escalation of house prices if there's a serious crash. So rather than try to ward it off, keep it at a distance, which is what governments are doing in a kind of panic, I mean, we should welcome it. Maybe really valuable.
Thank you, Michael. I think that this is the difference between degrowth by design or degrowth by disaster, right? So if we have the crash, who wants to respond to that? I see that also in the chat there are a few responses, but Daniel, Hans, do you want to jump in? And then please, afterwards, I think that Bill and Tom should also jump in.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I can respond to the first point raised by you, Michael, about the necessity to invest sort of surplus money or capital, if you wish, on the individual basis. I mean, there we see the interconnection again of housing provision with economic systems and welfare systems, because really it's a form of privatized Keynesianism that has unfolded because of mounting public debt, and this interconnection creates these systemic necessities, which we have now already discussed in the first round of discussions, that we now structurally depend as an economy on this inflation of these house prices. I mentioned but didn't explain an initiative that I think is quite interesting in this regard, which is the German Mietshäuser-Syndikat. So there you have, it's a form of collective ownership. Basically, you create a home. You don't have to new build. You can also convert existing stock into a community project where you live together with different people. You create a limited liability company that owns 50% of the building, and then 50% of the building is owned by this umbrella organization. And this ensures that this building can never be sold to the market. It will always belong to the umbrella organization and the limited liability company. And this is an avenue to invest your surplus capital, because if you have money lying around and you would like to live in a community instead of, in a single apartment, then you can use this money, find a group that wants to live with you in such a project, and you can invest this money, and it will stay in this project forever and not go to a publicly listed real estate company, for example. So I think there are also different models that are also attempting to scale out a bit, so that it's not just individual initiatives, but actually a solution for many people to address their housing needs on the one hand, but also they need to maybe invest some of the money that they have accumulated over the years.
Yeah. Thank you, Hans. This is fascinating. I think that's one of the beautiful things of working in these international environments, that every time sometimes we have a question like what is happening in the UK, and then you look at Germany and you learn what is happening. There is so much cross-learning that could happen at those intersections. So thanks for sharing that example. And I see that in the chat we have 2 questions regarding communities and co-ops that maybe, Daniel, you wanna take in. So one is of Tom. Tom, would you like to unmute yourself, or do you prefer if I read it?
Go ahead and read it. It's fine.
Okay. So it's what happens if you aren't part of any of these communities. So communities like the top-down deals with the atomized or disconnected housing need. And there is an argument for enfranchising everyone through automatic affiliation with organizations with legal claims on land or property. This would be one of the questions. And the second question is instead, co-ops already exist in some countries, but the organizations that oversee them get watered down, or dare I say corrupted, and they forget what they exist for. How can we strengthen existing co-ops?
Yeah, I think very interesting questions. I think just to link it into Michael Edwards' second point around the asset collapse, and perhaps mechanisms there where local authorities or municipalities buy back properties as a way of then decommodifying, and essentially that then creates a larger pool of decommodified housing that is essentially addressing part of what Tom's point is around a broader enfranchisement, that you don't necessarily have to belong to a particular community that is well organized and well resourced, or trying to, but there are mechanisms of enfranchisement for much broader sections of the population, and yeah, having sort of a more stable municipal provision of homes as well. I suppose the co-op element brings back the governance and brings back the what you might call the stewardship of homes, down to the sort of autonomy of stewardship of homes for groups of people, and having stronger governance mechanisms. The co-ops can become isolated. Co-ops can become also quite old and perhaps fossilized in their structures as well. And perhaps returning to some of the principles of the cooperative movement of supporting other co-ops, umbrella cooperatives that are also supported through resources and also through legislation. And there's a period in this country, in the UK, in London, for example, there was huge support for cooperatives in the 80s by the government, the local government at the time. And there's a sort of institutional middle set of institutions that also need to be strengthened. So that's part of the broad set of ideas. Bill says Swiss
good
Swiss have
mechanism.
good mechanisms to prevent co-ops going private and demutualizing. This is something that I've seen in smaller, more historical co-ops in this country, and especially in London, where there's a huge uplift in value that people want to capture.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks a lot. I think and I think it would be nice. Paul, would you like to, if you can, I don't want to put you on the spotlight, but Paul Chatterton, because there's Stephen Paul in the call, would you like to comment on this in light of your expertise?
Hello, hiya. Wonderful,
Hi.
thanks. So I'm just writing things in the chat. No, I mean, it's just, yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking about the practical routes to establishing post-growth housing, the asset base we need to develop this, and those middle-level institutions that we need now to support this, and radicalising the community land trust movement, and just acquiring assets wherever we can, because they're just, it's different in other European countries, but in the UK, we're just losing the asset base at a rapid rate, and there won't be anything left soon. And what is left will be sucked up the income hierarchy, and there'll be nothing left, certainly not for the bottom end. And what do we do about that? So how do we protect what we've got and acquire a bit more stuff? Civic Square's doing some really interesting stuff in Birmingham with Ladywood, and just, acquiring that asset base, but building up a resource base so we can start to acquire assets for more post-growth experiments is where we're at. Philanthropic organizations, they're sitting on vast resources, but they only release 4% a year. Like, how do we get more access to more of that stuff? How do we use social and carbon value to maybe release some ethical investments into the projects we're doing? I'm not sure, but we need to really throw all our thinking at this. To this agenda,
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Paul. You raised some important points for the agenda and for what we should do in terms of next steps and what we should think about. So I think it's very valid points. And I see, Chev, would you like to jump in and comment on what you were writing in the chat? Again, I don't want to put you in the spotlight, so if you can't speak with the mic, it's no problem. Maybe. Okay, it's no problem in case it doesn't work. I just saw that there were interesting things happening in the chat. I think you should all be able to have access to the chat at the end of the call, because there is a lot of stuff that is being shared. And perhaps also another very short comment I wanted to make about the idea of what about those communities that are not part of communities. Well, that is also one of the current challenges that we have. We live in apartments, so really literally apart from each other. And so building communities is incredibly difficult. And but at the same, there is a reciprocal relationship between living in certain forms of housing that is conducive to create those communities, and having those communities at the start to create that form of housing. So that's where the suggestions also of Daniel come into play. So
there's an interesting point by Judith Reiser on the dichotomy between home ownership and rental. Again, this is in the UK, but we could also talk about more broadly that relationship between ownership and renting elsewhere as well, which is more than using housing as an investment. It means more security, freedom of use, and arranging homes subject to mortgage restrictions, etc. So I suppose that's the idea of the individual home ownership being seen as something more secure than rental in particular regimes. And I think this is something that is elsewhere in Europe. There's been a lot more fighting back in terms of renters' rights, and maybe Hans.
Maybe I can come in on this, and this was maybe my last point I would like to make concerning this discussion, because one thing that I think would certainly help towards a transition towards degrowth housing is to create something that is at least similar to tenure neutrality, so that while we need to strengthen alternative forms of living, it would be not very realistic to assume that private markets for rent would disappear. But there again, it is possible to actively regulate the private rent, so that dynamics such as in Germany, for example, where I'm now based, or in the UK cannot happen. And a successful example for this would be both Austria and Switzerland, who have quite tightly regulated private rental markets. That would be something, but then also to stop idealizing home ownership, which is the prioritized tenure form, not only in the UK, but also in different European countries. And this would or could happen on the one hand economically, stop economically pushing a agenda of home ownership, but then also socioculturally. And this is where this manifesto comes in to really show that this sort of communal living that you also just talked about, Anna, is actually superior, instead of living in an apartment that you own, whereas you could actually own something collectively and then also live and dwell together.
Thank you, Hans. And perhaps just to conclude, I saw a comment that is quite important by Drew Harris on whether in this manifesto we're endorsing centralized or decentralized decommodification. And it makes me smile because it was part of a lot of our conversations. So I think we represent in this kind of broader group of people who have different visions and theories of change, of whether and we reported examples of both. We reported examples of changes that are happening through the example, for instance, that you mentioned in the chat of Singapore, and others instead who are cooperatives or certain forms of community and trust, to show the diversity of ways in which housing challenges are being addressed in the manifesto. So the manifesto brings these clear points of what we think all together that should be a kind of the end goal for housing. And we're open to discussions on what is the theory of change for this. But we wanted to bring together as many people as possible at this stage without creating too strong divisions that already exist and fragment quite strongly movements who are fighting for the same end goal. So I hope it answers your question. But it was a very good work of discussion, continuous discussion, and trying to understand where we stand and how to move towards a shared manifesto, despite having different theories of change. So I'm aware we're late by 1 minute. So I wanted to really thank everybody for being here, for coming today. I remind all of you of the points that we put in there in the slides about the next steps: to sign the manifesto, to share it around. We are so happy to know that it's going to be even translated in Greek and read at a conference in Greece. So there's different people who are trying to translate it and to use it in different ways. Reach out to us. If you want to write a post on our Substack, please do so on the points that were discussed today, on doubts that you have, on questions that you have. We need to write. We need to make it, to spread it as much as possible so that people can find a common place where to share resources and ideas. Daniel and Hans, do you want to say a last word?
No, thank you very much for joining us. And this is efforts of taking place in lots of different places across the world, really. So we want to join up with them and keep the discussion going, really. Thank you.
Yeah, nothing to add really. Besides that, I'm really happy to see the energy also in the discussion, and that people want to bring their points across and have many questions. And I'm happy to keep on discussing this in the future. Yeah.
So thank you so much. Thank you, all of you. And have a lovely winter time break.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.